I have treated shattered bones and failing organs, but the most brutal hemorrhage I ever witnessed was a human soul bleeding out in plain sight. 4 wealthy sociopaths bet thousands on a vulnerable couple's psychological assassination. This is the clinical autopsy of an emotional murder, and how I stopped it. I have signed countless death certificates throughout my 30 years of medical practice, yet the most terrifying, fatal wounds I have ever examined left absolutely no physical mark on the flesh. We are rigidly conditioned to fear tumors, failing organs, and aggressive pathogens, completely oblivious to the fact that the most devastating terminal illness of our modern age is the silent, calculated cruelty inflicted by human beings upon one another. I have seen the very architecture of a human spirit collapse under the weight of engineered humiliation. I have watched souls hemorrhage in plain sight while their predators smiled. What you are about to hear is not a mere anecdote. It is a psychological autopsy of an emotional murder that was stopped just seconds before the victim flatlined. A manufactured tragedy that will irrevocably change how you view the people around you. Warmly welcomes you to another profound examination of the human condition. If this journey into the darkest and most resilient corners of human nature captivates you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support is the vital pulse that empowers us to continue uncovering these deeply impactful stories. In my decades of observing the intricate anatomy of human suffering, I have realized that society fundamentally misdiagnoses the true nature of strength. We erroneously equate power with a hardened, aggressive exterior, or the sheer, ruthless force required to dominate the vulnerable. But true strength is never loud, and cruelty is merely the desperate, erratic thrashing of a diseased mind. I have reviewed the metaphorical diagnostic reports of thousands of lives. Patients like Walter, whose chronic, unyielding anger triggered a literal cardiac arrest, or Margaret, whose relentless bitterness aged her cellular structure faster than any biological clock could dictate. Emotional cruelty is a silent corrosion, a toxic acid that slowly dissolves both the perpetrator and the victim. Tonight, we examine a distinctly chilling pathology that unfolded not in the sterile, fluorescent glare of a clinical examination room, but within the softly lit, velvet-draped confines of an upscale restaurant. The ambient lighting and the hushed clinking of fine crystal created an atmosphere of profound tranquility, a beautiful facade completely juxtaposed against the festering psychological infection that was actively being introduced. At a corner table sat 2 unsuspecting individuals. The man, Ethan, exhibited the subtle, restless hypervigilance of a survivor bracing for an unseen blow. Across from him sat Rachel, a woman radiating an acute, almost suffocating anxiety, her shoulders severely curled inward like a terrified patient bracing for a terminal diagnosis. What made this breathtakingly quiet scene a tragedy waiting to detonate was a hidden, malignant pathology. They were entirely unaware that they had just stepped into a manufactured theater of cruelty, carefully orchestrated by unseen observers to destroy their dignity for mere sport. To understand how this toxic environment was so flawlessly cultivated, we must first examine the pathogens themselves, the architects of this impending emotional slaughter who operated from the restaurant's elevated mezzanine. They were a quartet of affluent, impeccably dressed professionals, individuals whom society instinctively rewards and respects based entirely on their superficial polish and financial aggressively. In my clinical view, however, they were suffering from a severe, undiagnosed moral necrosis. Their wealth had inoculated them against consequence, creating a profound empathy deficit that required increasingly extreme stimuli to feel anything at all. For them, Ethan and Rachel were not human beings possessing fragile hopes and beating hearts. They were merely biological playthings, unwitting lab rats dropped into a maze designed entirely for their predator's amusement. I later learned the sickening mechanics of their game. They routinely scoured online support groups for individuals struggling with severe social anxiety or depression, fabricating elaborate romantic personas to lure these vulnerable people into public spaces. Ethan, a man who had spent 3 years meticulously rebuilding his life after a devastating nervous breakdown, believed he was finally meeting a kindred spirit. Rachel, paralyzed by a lifetime of emotional abandonment, thought she had finally found someone who understood her silence. The orchestrators had manipulated them both into meeting each other under the guise of an exclusive matchmaking service, secretly betting thousands of dollars on which of the two would suffer a visible panic attack first. It was a malignancy of the highest order, a calculated infection of hope, designed only to be violently withdrawn. Watching the perpetrators sip their vintage wine, their eyes gleaming with the predatory anticipation of a spectator at a Roman Colosseum, I felt a deep, instinctual revulsion. I have held lungs blackened by decades of smoke and livers hardened by years of abuse, but examining the cold, calculating intent of those 4 individuals from across the room, I realized I was witnessing a far more lethal rot. They were weaponizing intimacy, introducing a psychological virus into the sterile field of Ethan and Rachel's hard-won bravery. The dinner was proceeding exactly as the sociopathic architects had planned, the tension at the corner table building as 2 socially paralyzed strangers tried desperately to navigate a connection that had been fundamentally poisoned from its inception. As the appetizers were cleared, the meticulously designed incubation period ended, and the acute phase of their suffering violently commenced. The orchestrators on the mezzanine signaled the maitre d', a man whose compliance had been bought with a gratuitous tip, to deliver the instrument of their cruelty. It was a silver platter carrying an incredibly expensive bottle of champagne and an ornate envelope. I watched Ethan's hands tremble slightly as he broke the wax seal, his posture shifting from guarded hypervigilance to a fleeting, heartbreaking glimmer of hope. He read the card aloud to Rachel, his voice barely carrying over the ambient jazz. I could not hear the exact words, but I did not need to. The physiological response told the entire, devastating story. The note revealed the entirety of the grotesque wager, explicitly mocking their trauma, their awkwardness, and their pathetic belief that they were worthy of love. In my decades of medicine, I have seen the exact moment a patient's body gives up fighting a terminal disease, and the physical manifestation of a breaking soul is chillingly identical. The color violently drained from Ethan's face, an acute ischemic response triggered by massive psychological shock. His shoulders collapsed, not with relaxation, but with the total structural failure of a man whose spirit had just been snapped in half. Across from him, Rachel's reaction was a textbook neurological freeze response. Her eyes dilated wildly, her breathing became shallow and erratic, and she pulled her arms tightly across her chest as if trying to hold her shattering internal organs together. Up on the balcony, the 4 architects of this misery erupted into hushed, triumphant laughter, raising their glasses in a toast to their successful psychological assassination. It was a hemorrhage of human dignity occurring in plain sight, a fatal emotional trauma unfolding while the rest of the dining room continued cutting their steaks and discussing the stock market, completely oblivious. Ethan stared at the table, his jaw clenched so tightly I feared his teeth might fracture, tears of profound, unadulterated shame pooling in his eyes but refusing to fall. Rachel began to hyperventilate silently, the toxic acid of engineered humiliation dissolving her delicate defenses in real time. They were dying right there in the corner booth, their self-worth flatlining amidst the scent of truffles and the sound of clinking crystal. It was at this exact moment, as the life force seemingly drained from their eyes, that I refused to remain a mere observer to a spiritual homicide. Medical ethics demand that we intervene when a life is in immediate peril, and I recognized with absolute certainty that the psychological trauma being inflicted would be a lethal blow to their futures if left unarrested. I stood up, abandoning my own meal, and walked toward their table with the deliberate, unyielding pace of an attending physician entering a trauma bay. I intercepted the mocking waitstaff, gently but firmly taking the silver platter and the cruel note from Ethan's paralyzed hands. I did not offer them empty platitudes. Acute trauma requires decisive, grounding authority. I leaned down, placing myself directly in their line of sight to break the dissociative trance, and spoke with a calm, clinical certainty. I told them exactly what I had observed from the mezzanine, meticulously dissecting the pathology of the people who had done this to them. I explained that the sickness in this room did not reside within their social anxiety or their vulnerability. It resided entirely in the necrotic, hollow chests of the cowards laughing above us. By naming the disease, by shifting the diagnosis from their perceived inadequacy to the perpetrator's sociopathy, I watched the first desperate gasps of emotional oxygen return to their lungs. I then turned my attention to the balcony. I did not shout, nor did I cause a theatrical scene. Instead, I used the profound, penetrating volume of absolute contempt, projecting my voice just enough to cut through their smug celebration. I diagnosed them, loudly, analytically, stripping away their veneer of wealth to expose the pathetic, infantile sadism beneath. The laughter choked in their throats. The restaurant fell into a sudden, heavy silence as the surrounding patrons turned their gaze upward, the invisible theater lights suddenly exposing the predators to the very public scrutiny they had tried to weaponize against their victims. I watched the orchestrators shrink, their artificial power evaporating the moment their psychological infection was exposed to the harsh, sterilizing light of human decency. I offered my hands to Ethan and Rachel, and together we walked out of the establishment, leaving the architects of agony drowning in their own sudden, inescapable shame. Pulling them from the wreckage of that restaurant was only the triage. The true work of healing the spirit began in the quiet aftermath of survival. We sat on a bench just outside the doors, the cool night air acting as a natural anesthetic against the burning humiliation they had just endured. I did not press them to speak. In trauma medicine, sometimes the most profound healing occurs in the simple, shared silence of surviving a fatal event. When Ethan finally looked up, the raw, bleeding wound of his pride had begun to coagulate, replaced by a fierce, undeniable spark of resilience. He turned to Rachel, a woman he had met barely an hour ago under the most toxic circumstances imaginable, and offered a genuine, shaky apology for the ordeal. Rachel, whose entire life had been defined by shrinking away from pain, did something medically and spiritually miraculous. She reached out and took his hand. It was not a gesture of romantic cliché, but the profound solidarity of two soldiers who had survived the same trench warfare. The prognosis for a broken soul is never a return to the original unblemished state. Psychological wounds of this magnitude leave deep, permanent scars. But as any pathologist will tell you, scar tissue is biologically thicker, stronger, and more resilient than the original skin. The cruelty they experienced that night was intended to destroy them, but instead, it inadvertently forged a connection built on absolute, unvarnished truth. They had witnessed each other at the absolute point of collapse and realized that they were not unlovable, but simply human. I have kept in touch with both of them over the years. They did not marry or fall into a fairy tale romance, but they became fiercely protective anchors in each other's lives, proving that the deepest bonds are often forged in the fires of survived trauma. The ultimate lesson I extracted from that night is that while cruelty is indeed the most devastating terminal illness of our modern age, the human capacity for empathy remains its only known cure. Strength is not the ability to inflict pain without remorse, but the courage to remain soft in a world determined to break you. As we close this chapter, I ask you to look closely at the invisible battles fought by the strangers around you. Be the intervention. Be the cure. Because the life you save with a moment of radical empathy may just be the one that restores your own faith in humanity. The harrowing events of that evening serve as a stark reminder that the most dangerous pathogens in our society are not biological, but psychological. We live in a world where unchecked privilege and moral decay can easily masquerade as sophistication, allowing those with a profound empathy deficit to weaponize the vulnerabilities of others for mere entertainment. Yet, the ordeal of Ethan and Rachel demonstrates that even the most calculated psychological assassinations can be thwarted by a single, decisive act of intervention. When we choose not to be passive bystanders, we strip abusers of their power and expose their cruelty to the sterilizing light of public accountability. More importantly, this story illuminates the incredible biological and spiritual truth about human resilience. We are built to heal. Just as scar tissue forms to protect a physical wound, shared trauma can forge unbreakable bonds of solidarity. The architects of this agony intended to completely shatter two fragile souls, but their sociopathic game inadvertently catalyzed a profound connection rooted in authentic survival. Ultimately, the narrative proves that while malice can meticulously design a trap, it is powerless against the raw, uncompromising strength of radical empathy. Healing does not mean returning to an unblemished state. It means moving forward with the armored resilience of having survived the worst of human nature and choosing to remain compassionate anyway. Cruelty thrives only in the vacuum of collective apathy, but radical empathy is the ultimate antidote. True strength is never defined by the ability to exploit the weaknesses of others, nor by remaining untouched by emotion. Real strength is the courage to protect the vulnerable, name the injustice in the room, and maintain your own soft humanity in a society that frequently rewards sociopathic behavior. Be the intervention. Refuse to be a silent observer to emotional or psychological abuse, whether in the workplace, online, or in public. A single, calm voice of authority can break the trance of humiliation and save someone's dignity. Teammate your scars. Stop viewing your anxieties, past traumas, or emotional sensitivities as defects. Recognize that your capacity to feel deeply makes you biologically and spiritually stronger than those who rely on malice to feel alive. Seek authentic solidarity. Build your social circle based on unvarnished truth rather than superficial polish. Cultivate relationships with people who stand by you in moments of collapse, as these bonds will act as your armor against a chaotic world. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment where a stranger bravely stepped in to help during a difficult situation? Please kindly share your story or perspective in the comments below so our community can read and draw inspiration from your experience. If you found this narrative meaningful, please hit the subscribe button to support the channel. Your subscription gives us the motivation to keep creating deep, impactful content just like this.